We started Nature League to explore the amazingness of life on Earth. Over the past year, we've explored a ton of different topics, formats, and themes, and had a lot of fun along the way. To celebrate this first year of content, we'd like to share a compilation video from our second month, which explored the theme of biodiversity. It began with a lesson plan about the types and values of biodiversity on Earth. Biodiversity is definitely a buzzword nowadays, and you've most likely come across it in the news or pop culture because we're losing so much of it on the species level. But let's back up a second. I said species level because there are actually several accepted ways to think about biodiversity. The species level definition goes something like the variety of species in an ecological community. But species level biodiversity doesn't quite tell the whole story. We can also think of biodiversity on the genetic level, which determines the evolutionary potential of all of those species. But genes are tiny, right? What about something bigger? Well, biodiversity can also be considered on the ecosystem level. So a much more realistic view of the diversity of life on Earth is one that spans all the way from genes to ecosystems. In addition to levels of biodiversity, we can also think about dimensions of biodiversity. Biologists use some odd terms for the three main dimensions, so let's break these down. The first dimension of biodiversity is the taxonomic or classification dimension of biodiversity. This is really just how many different species exist and where they are. But this dimension doesn't really capture anything about these species. It's simply just how many there are. What's more informative is the history of the species in an area and how related they are. Like, it's one thing to say that there are 5 humans in a space, but another thing to say that there are 5 siblings in a space. One seems more diverse than the other. This is where the phylogenetic dimension comes in. Phylogenetics is a technical term for the history and relationships among species throughout time. So the phylogenetic dimension of biodiversity is basically considering how unique something is evolutionarily, or how long a certain species has existed since diverging from a common ancestor. Take my tuatara friend back here. This species is the only remaining member of an order of reptiles that lived during the age of dinosaurs, and all except the tuatara went extinct about 60 million years ago. So this species represents a critical piece of phylogenetic biodiversity. Functional biodiversity is exactly what it sounds like. What are the ecological functions of the species in this area? This dimension is all about the jobs or niches of each species. So if a certain region has species that do a ton of different ecological jobs and fill many ecological niches, we'd say the region is high in functional biodiversity. I think the most interesting thing about biodiversity isn't its definition or level or dimension, but rather its value and use. Like, why do we or should we care about its existence? For the rest of this lesson plan, I'd like to explore 3 different types of uses of biodiversity: direct use, indirect use, and non-use. Direct use consists of provisioning services. Basically, organisms and their parts or products are used directly for human benefit. Think food, building materials, paper products, medicine, etc. Indirect use consists of regulating and supporting services. These services are ones that don't directly use an organism, but rather use something the organism regulates or contributes to. Examples include climate regulation, flood protection, and water filtration. So what about non-use? This one is my favorite. It turns out there are lots of ways we use biodiversity without actually using it at all. These kinds of services are cultural, aesthetic, and even spiritual. Non-use values of biodiversity are intrinsic or inherent. It's a philosophical concept and can be described as something having value on its own, independent of its value for anyone or anything else. The concept is easier to understand with some examples. These non-use values include existence value, bequest value, and potential value. Let's look at existence value first. Existence value is the value of knowing something exists even if you never use it or see it. So, like, I personally value snow leopards being alive even though I don't eat them, or use them for clothing, or benefit from them affecting the climate, or interact with them. I just like knowing that they exist. Bequest value is another example of a non-use value of biodiversity. This is the value of knowing something will exist for future generations. Express something like, I value sharks being alive so that my grandchildren can enjoy them. And then there's potential value, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is valuing biodiversity because it might come in handy to use in the future. When that time comes, the value changes from non-use to use. But while it's hypothetical, it's technically non-use. So biodiversity has a lot of different uses, and the ways in which we personally rank the importance of those uses comes down to values. Some scientists argue that biodiversity might make ecosystems more stable and resilient, but this is incredibly hard to measure and quantify. Whatever your values are, there's something for everyone to love about the incredible diversity of life on Earth. We've just scratched the surface of this complex but fascinating topic, and I challenge you to discover even more uses and values of biodiversity in your own life. The idea of biodiversity usually comes along with the thought of a a rainforest or coral reef, but you can actually find biodiversity right in the middle of human developments. In this month's field trip, we uncovered biodiversity in a compounding pharmacy in downtown Missoula.
Now, when you think about a field trip for biodiversity theme month, you might think about, going to the rainforest or a coral reef. But the thing is, you can actually find biodiversity even in the most human-built environments. So we're right here in downtown Missoula where we are going to check out some pieces of biodiversity. Now, during our lesson plan, we talked about a couple different ways that we can think about biodiversity, and one of them was use. So actually using things, provisioning services like food or shelter or medicine. And medicine is actually a really cool piece of biodiversity in terms of how humans use it.
Right now we are here in downtown Missoula and we've actually come inside a compounding pharmacy. Compounding pharmacies are really cool because they're kind of like that old school feel. So think about actually really using that chemistry and making something specific to the dosage or the mixture that you need. And that's what they do here. So that means they have more raw materials than perhaps somewhere else, like a mainstream drugstore. So when you're inside a pharmacy, there's actually biodiversity everywhere. And we can actually just start right here. These are a bunch of essential oils, and you may have heard of essential oils, you might even have some in your house, might be something your mom uses, whatever it is. If you look closer, you'll actually see that essential oils can be seen on the species level. Each one is from a different species of plant, and they actually have it labeled with the genus and species right here. So just on this countertop, we're looking at close to 20 different species, which is super awesome, and probably not the way you usually think about something like essential oils. So right up here you can see something that you might be more used to thinking about at the grocery store, but there's actually things that come from different fruits that are in all kinds of medicines that we use. So right here we have some cranberry extract. Now what about something that's not a plant? What about an animal, for example? How about fish? So if we check this out, a lot of different supplements for fatty acids and omega-3s come from fish species that you can see right here. And let's think even smaller. What about bacteria? Check this out. In probiotics, you actually have a ton of different species depending on the brand and what kind of ingredients have been added. But if you look on the back here, you can actually see there are several species of bacteria just in this single pill of a probiotic. So look, you've got a fruit, you've got a fish, you've got bacteria all sitting here on one shelf. Even your run-of-the-mill aspirin pill is actually derived from a plant species, which is the white willow tree. So even if the plant species is not actually being used in the main form, sometimes they're used as additives. So for example, when a cream has aloe added into it, that's coming from a species. Or something like Vapor Rub, that awesome minty kind of thing that you have, well, that's actually from two different species. You got eucalyptus and also menthol, which are both derived from species. And now a word. Not from our sponsors, but from the dictionary. Welcome to this month's Wild Word. Once a month on Nature League, we'll look at the etymology, or origin and history, of words related to nature. This month's theme is biodiversity, so we're going to examine a word that's used throughout the material in this topic. The word is organism. This is a pretty common word, and we certainly use its pieces, organ and ism, in many different English words. But let's dig in deeper and check out these parts. The ending, ism, is a common one. Ism can be traced back to both Latin and Greek as isma and ismos, respectively. This ending was added to words to signify a practice or teaching of something. So what is the word organism hinting at practicing? Let's look at the first piece of the word, which is organ. This one is interesting because over the course of history, the word organ started being used in two different ways. The word organum in Latin translates to instrument, like a mechanical device, but also translates to organ, like the musical organ pipe. But the plot thickens. There's also a verb in Latin, organizo, which means to organize. The word organism most likely comes from a combination of the noun form, meaning instrument, and the verb form, meaning organize. So while the former Merriam-Webster definition of organism is a complex structure of interdependent and subordinate elements whose relations and properties are largely determined by their function in the whole, organism literally means the practice of organizing or being a device. I love the connotation of this word. It means that when people long ago were considering life on Earth and calling all the forms they encountered organisms, these people were recognizing that the life forms not only had a purpose, but were highly organized. And this was all before we even knew about the molecular structure of things. And that is pretty awesome.
So being in the pharmacy reminded me of some really cool examples I'd learned along the way in terms of studying biodiversity and how it's used in pharmaceuticals. So for example, I remembered that the pit viper, so a snake, is actually where we got ACE inhibitors, which is for blood pressure, which is a major thing that we use. Also AZT, which is a compound that's used for treating HIV and AIDS complications, which used to be a major deal, but with the advent of AZT, it's lessened the symptoms for people living with that disease. And that was actually derived from a marine sponge. So people living with this debilitating disease are actually being helped by an organism they've never even met that's deep in the sea somewhere, which is really, really cool when you think about it. But biodiversity is way more than just how we use it. It has value in all kinds of ways. So for example, it's not just provisioning services like I'm eating it or I'm using it for medicine. It's also regulating services, things we might not even think about. So like, let's take this tree right here. As I speak, it's actually taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and in return putting oxygen back, something that we don't really think about when we're just walking around and see trees downtown. And then there's my favorite value of biodiversity, which is intrinsic value. All of the species of life on Earth, big and small, all have value just because they exist, which is something I think is pretty awesome.
Biodiversity is something you can find pretty much anywhere on Earth. You just have to look for it. While biodiversity is widespread, there can be differences in the complexity of systems and within food webs. We next explored biodiversity in a format called Denatured, where I broke down a popular peer-reviewed journal article on system complexity and extinction vulnerability. For this month's Denatured segment, we're going to look at an article released in February of 2018 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. In this month's lesson plan, we talked about the different uses and values of biodiversity. I mentioned at the end that scientists aren't sure if biodiversity actually helps stabilize ecosystems because it's really hard to measure. Well, this article investigated exactly that. The title of the paper is Trophic Redundancy Reduces Vulnerability to Extinction Cascades. I've definitely seen worse when it comes to titles using dense language, but there's still some vocab we should go through to get off to a strong start. Trophic redundancy is the concept of having multiple species in each trophic or food level. Basically, a situation where you have multiple producers and multiple consumers at each level of the food chain, or in each available niche or job. What about extinction cascades? Well, this phrase refers to losing species in a sort of chain reaction process. Imagine dominoes knocking each other over, but replace those dominoes with living species. Directly losing one species is called a primary extinction, and if that extinction causes another, we call it a secondary extinction. And so on. To understand the connection between redundancy and cascades, let's consider a grocery store. There are all kinds of workers in a grocery store. Stockers, managers, cashiers, baggers, etc. Trophic redundancy in this situation would be having several stockers, maybe 2 managers, 10 cashiers, something like that. Basically, more than one worker in each role, but each worker only knows how to do their job. So what happens if you only have a single cashier and that person decides to quit? There's no one available to take their place, so that function of the store is gone. Does that then affect the other workers? This is the question that the authors of the study are asking. If there are multiple species occupying a trophic level or niche, does that decrease how vulnerable other species will be to extinction? I mean, it seems like a simple yes, right? But that's the fascinating thing. Even though it makes sense intuitively, it turns out that understanding the relationship between food web complexity and stability is really complicated, and no study has ever even been able to test any of these predictions with experimental data. Here's how the authors of this study went about investigating it. They set up a series of outdoor controlled environments called mesocosms. In these, they put together communities of 4 trophic or food web levels. Here are what these webs looked like. There was one plant at the bottom level, that's the dark green dot, 3 species of aphids, which are insects that eat the plant. Those are the 3 light green dots. 3 parasitoid wasps that each eat one of the aphids. Those are the blue dots, and each one only eats the aphid shown by the line. And hyperparasitoid wasps that eat all of the parasitoid wasps. That's the black dot up top. Let's make our lives a bit easier and shorten some names. For the sake of this segment, we'll call the parasitoid wasps and call the hyperparasitoid wasps the top predator. So now we have a plant, some aphids, some wasps, and a top predator. Since there's only one species of wasp that eats each species of aphid, there is no trophic redundancy in this setup. Each species only does one job. In the grocery store version of this, there aren't any substitutes if the cashier dips out. The researchers also set up a mesocosm with trophic redundancy. This higher complexity food web looked like the simpler version, except they added another plant species, added another aphid species, and added an additional wasp that ate more than one type of aphid. The communities and all of the replicates were left to grow for about 3 generations. At that point, the researchers removed one species of wasps in half of the setups. This represents a primary extinction. And on the picture, it's the wasp that's crossed out. Then they watched the other wasps on that trophic level to see if any secondary extinctions occurred. So what'd they find? Were the redundant, more biodiverse communities more resilient to secondary extinctions? The team found that secondary extinctions were significantly more likely in the simple communities than in the complex ones. This is what they predicted, which is pretty cool. But to explain it, they needed to figure out how it happened. In all of the experiments, removing the species of wasps made the population of aphids that they eat get denser. Makes perfect sense. It's way easier to reach a higher population density if you aren't being, well, eaten. This means the other 2 aphid species were struggling to compete with these aphids for resources. Aphid species 2 and 3 were sitting there like, man, that aphid species is so lucky its predator was removed, must be nice, while aphid species 1 just kept on eating. But how does this affect the other wasps? Well, the 2 aphids getting out-eaten started having smaller populations. This means the 2 wasps that only feed on those 2 aphids have less to eat and might run into trouble. However, in the complex community with redundancy, that successful aphid was occasionally eaten by the extra wasp the researchers added in. So the competition for resources wasn't as bad for the other 2 aphids, and the wasps that eat them did okay. Overall, removing one wasp indirectly caused declines in the other wasps at the same trophic level. However, the effect was significantly bigger in the simpler, less biodiverse communities. So, in this study, it turned out that losing biodiversity made the communities more vulnerable to secondary extinctions. And since secondary extinctions can make communities simpler, this could cause even more extinctions down the line. So why did this particular article make it into this prestigious journal? Well, here's what I think. First off, journals love to publish studies that are novel. The editors like being able to say, check it out, in our journal there's this awesome study and it's never been done before. That's certainly part of what's happening here. Ecologists have long considered the effects of having more species on reducing the risk of extinctions, but the authors state, previously, all knowledge on the relationship between food web structure and extinction cascades was based on theory alone. Our experimental evidence demonstrates that these effects are real. That's a big deal. Not only did the team move a concept from theory into real evidence, but they were the first to do it. Another reason this paper made the cut is because it addresses something that is very relevant. Extinction rates are the highest they've been in recent history, and understanding the domino effect of extinctions is absolutely critical moving forward. For example, if we're going to choose where to put our conservation efforts, we need to know if ecosystems with less redundancy are at more risk. You've probably heard that the devil's in the details, but in scientific articles, he's definitely in the methods section. Whenever I read papers in high-profile journals, I like to look out for potential pitfalls in the methodology and conclusions. One potential issue with the study is that there are other things that could have caused the secondary extinctions. For example, it might have been something like the sheer number of species present, and nothing to do with the food web redundancy. Well, the authors had this criticism in mind. To account for those confounding variables, they ran simulations in addition to their mesocosm experiments. And sure enough, the simulations also provided clear evidence that redundancy played a significant role, while species richness had no effect. A separate issue I have with this study is that small and controlled situations set up by researchers are exactly that, small and controlled. I feel like it's impossible to ever truly capture, much less predict, the unbelievably complex interactions between species in the wild. I mean, it's possible these results only apply to aphids and wasps, and not to biodiversity overall. Therefore, I remain open-minded and skeptical about the role biodiversity might play in preventing extinction cascades. To round out the topic of biodiversity, I enlisted the help of my good friend Adrian Adams. In our second installment of From A to B, Adrian asked me why more complex life forms are found on land than in water. What do you have for me this month, Adrian?
Okay, so if dolphins are so smart, why can't they build cars? So
all right.
Okay, no. So humans, we all manipulate things with our hands, and manipulating the environment and creating tools is like how you become an advanced, like a really advanced species, right? So how come there are no animals in the ocean that manipulate their environment like we do? Like, why did life have to leave the ocean and come on land for humans to become what we are? Why couldn't that fish that, like, you know, waddled up on land was like, and then just waddle back into the ocean and just keep evolving.
The first couple probably did, to be fair. The first 100 or so, most likely it looked something like that.
I'm not into it.
First of all, talking about complexity, environment manipulation, and then, intelligence and tool making. So these are all a little bit different. So we gotta be a little fair. Almost all life on Earth manipulates its environment. It really does. And so then, because even by like moving space, creating space, that was almost bad.
Moving my cup.
But I, for example, altered your habitat.
You are not a cat. You are not playing the gravity game. Yep, still works.
Well, here's the thing. Like octopuses, they do incredible things with their tentacles. Each one of those suction pads, like they have neurons running through each one of their tentacles. So they are like thinking with each hand. So it's almost like they are like experiencing the world in a different way than us just touching things. I'm just trying to point out that there are all kinds of ways that an organism can manipulate its environment, okay? Yes, humans, there's definitely something about tool use, right? We said apes, which humans would be one of those. But what is it about land that would maybe lead to something like thumbs, right? Maybe that's kind of, right, one of these questions. Go ahead and say it.
Hey!
So that fish, right? This, there he is. Coming up, there's a couple of things other than that face.
That's the sound it made too. Sorry.
Couple of things besides that face and those sounds that would have been a problem. First of all,
how's it gonna get around?
Locomotion, right? That's exactly. How are we gonna move? And then think about structurally what it means to all of a sudden not have help with gravity. Because when you're in water, you are aided by the fact of either like flotation, buoyancy, and you don't have the effects of gravity. So the entire skeletal system had to change according to that kind of a weight, right? Collapsing on itself. So like the idea of like rib cages, our vertebra had to get stronger, our necks to support like the weight of a head, like not just with water.
Okay.
We had entire structural differences, right?
Okay.
So start thinking about if you didn't have those kinds of structures, land would feel like absolute hell in terms of like gravity all of a sudden.
That sounds like just a bad time. So why would you even want to go from the ocean onto land? But if we're talking about the first land creatures, there's no predators out there, right?
Yeah.
I assume it's not it wasn't going to be predators from the ocean going onto land. It would be the prey. And because plant life probably already evolved and was out there, there was just all this food and nothing to take it. So okay, so land is pretty dope.
I mean, you know,
the
the frontier land creatures. The interesting thing is that's one of the bits that we haven't quite figured out. We have guesses, so we have pretty decent hypotheses about why land, and those are some of the reasons. It's like, oh, maybe to avoid predation, or oh, maybe to get more prey, or oh, maybe there was just something energetically favorable. But when you're talking about biodiversity and how something might use tools or get these things called thumbs, you have to think about that evolutionary pressure, like that selective pressure. So you're on land, you're up against all this kind of stuff. The skeletal system has to change to adapt to the fact that there's gravity and locomotion, right?
Okay.
And so having a fin is not exactly the way to go anymore. But have you seen an X-ray or like a drawing or a skeleton of a whale?
No. I was going to say no before you said of a whale. I was just going to say, never seen a drawing, an X-ray, or a fin ever in my life. But I missed it. Honestly, though, I don't think I have of a whale.
Can you, in your mind, think about what a whale skeleton would look like? What do you think the skeleton of a fin looks like?
I don't know, just a big old thing of cartilage. Is there bones in there? Are there phalanges?
Are you serious right now? You thought it was a block of cartilage?
I don't know. It's not something I've ever thought about.
Oh, that's exciting. A whale's fin, so the pectoral fins, these right here, right?
The fins.
Yeah, they absolutely are, if you will, phalanges. It's basically the same thing. Whales have them. It literally looks like a human hand. And what about a bat's wing?
Yeah, a bat's wing, sure.
Think about that, but then it's encased in the whale, like the rest of the muscle and then skin and blubber.
It's mittens made of cartilage, if you would.
But no, but not, no, that's not correct. Nope, still not correct.
But it's not? So it's not a mitten?
You can't say mitten's made of cartilage because there's a lot of different tissue types that we see in that.
Flesh mittens. TM.
That one's fine. I'm not going to totally rule that out.
Okay.
This actually has a name. It's called homologous structures, which are structures that we see in a lot of different life forms on Earth. Something as different as a human to a bat to a whale, pretty much the same plan. And that's kind of the neat thing about biodiversity is you see all these crazy forms, but there are a couple of these basic structures that just do really well and haven't had reason to change.
Well, I mean, if you find something that just is like the optimal build for something, and then you just go from there, you know. But like these right here are like a perfect base, and then all we have to do is like modify that to suit water or to suit land.
That way, right? Because this was already happening because fish, and I mean, you can like, it's not that there are bones out, but there's the rays and the different kinds of structuring on fins.
Even just manipulating, like I'm visualizing like a stingray moving through the water, you know, it's got to do like a whole this thing, and it's not going to be doing any of this thing. A stingray might be a bad option because there's no bones in it.
Definitely a bad option. Fish, you can go with fish. We see that kind of motion. The fact that dolphins and whales, right, don't have this visible does not mean that body plan is not there. In fact, it is. But it hasn't evolved to be like, I've got thumbs, let me make manipulable tools, because guess what?
Cars.
Yeah, but you can't swim well as well with this, right? To have an actual fin is what is necessary for that environment.
So you're saying that the skeletal structure, like the basic idea, you know, a spine, limbs, a neck, all these things already existed on that fish that waddled out of the ocean, and it simply adapted to what it needed because it was already adapted to the water, and that's why it had a fin instead of a hand, and then all it had to do was just readapt a little differently to this new thing.
Well, just a ton of very small changes over time, right? And then there might have been different ways that organisms chose to or wound up surviving, right? Passing on genes or mutations that help them deal with those things we've already talked about land that is so rough, right? The fact that we have to have weight, the fact that we have to move, the fact that the body plan is different, right? These kinds of things.
The fact that you can't just like stop in the middle of whatever you're doing and be like, oh, it's nighttime, I'm gonna go to sleep now.
Also that.
You know, like fish.
Also that. So if there had been selective pressure for, I need to get rid of all the flesh mitten
TM.
around my hand because I need to grasp things and I can't and I'm gonna die because of it, then for all we know, dolphins could make cars and like really good ones. But they got the flesh in the way, right?
They are already a flesh car. I'm not keeping that one.
No.
Okay.
Discard.
Discard.
We'll do better next time. So does that make sense? Because making tools is just one way we can talk about complexity. But what about like brain capacity? In which case
Well, no, see, I was thinking about it from totally like a physiological standpoint. Like I was thinking that the human form is the optimal form for advanced life, when in fact it isn't. It's just the optimal form for advanced life on land. If you throw a human into the water, we suck.
I personally am far more graceful without gravity.
Oh, God.
People who see me walk, they're like, oh boy, but you should see me in the water.
Actually, I've never seen you in the water.
I'm an angel.
Oh, I believe it.
It's true. I don't bump into things nearly as much, probably because there's a more open space and not corners.
Well, technically, you're bumping into water the whole time. Thanks, everybody. It's been great.
It has been great. Do you know why?
Why?
Because I think you came to a pretty nice little conclusion that is one of the things we know about biodiversity, which is that we have so many versions because there are so many different versions of environments and selective pressures, right? And so the plan, whether it's the body plan or the eating plan or the way I use habitat plan, those plans are all different because life on Earth has evolved to the requirements set by it to just survive. And that's pretty awesome, right?
Yeah.
So it's okay for you to think about these things from a human perspective because you're a human. But as a shark, I think about them a little bit differently. You know?
Our second month was all about biodiversity, and we had a ton of fun researching, creating, and filming the content you've seen in this compilation. Thanks so much for watching, and if you'd like to keep going on Life on Earth adventures with us here on Nature League, make sure to go to youtube.com/natureleague, subscribe, and share.